Hey guys, welcome back to Let's Play Xenosaga Episode 3. Last time, database dive. This time, if you want some additional information about the Archon Cathedral, then we're going to have some of it here kind of explain what all that material was that we were stepping on, that crystalline substance that made really annoying sounds when anyone walked on it. It is said to have had the beginnings with the ancestors of the immigrant fleet who drifted to the planet. Within a giant crack in the earth, they discovered underground ruins believed to be related to the Zohar. There they built a facility to research the ruins and the Zohar, which we were exploring through. The above-ground building was a place for religious faith, and below, the Ormus researchers studied the crystalline material, and only Ormus cardinals were allowed to visit otherwise. Ziggy is of course closely connected to this through Voyager and his own death. Rennes-le-Château. Now, before we get into this, this is an actual location in France. It is believed, depending on who you talk to be the location where Mary Magdalene was buried, and her supporters, or potentially even where her genetic timeline, where her offspring are, because I can't think of words. They are confusing today. But, so that place is actually there. It is also, well, at least at one point I remember reading that it was also supposed to be where the 12 vessels of Anima or the 12 apostles were buried, or where they continued their work, depending on which information you believe is true. So there's a definite connection for why we found all of those things there in the game, considering the real-life parallels. The spherical landmass that appears in the story is not a chunk off the land from Lost Jerusalem floating in space. It just appeared that way. Now, there's another part to this as well, and that additional piece is, if you think about it, since the vessels of Anima were located on here, presumably toward the end of the existence of Lost Jerusalem, then how did we ended up getting them? And since they were known to be something that Vector had, presumably Wilhelm was the one who unearthed them. But we've had them since long before Rennes-le-Château appeared in Episode 3. So that's kind of the problem, is I think it appeared beforehand or something like that, because they went, Wilhelm and Kevin went there twice. The first time they got the vessels, but they didn't get Mary Magdalene's body, which is why when Kevin made KOS-MOS the first time, he didn't use the physical body of Mary Magdalene as he did when he used Telos. Well, the reason for that is because Chaos was on guard there. Chaos was protecting the area. How he did it, I don't know, but it's been implied through numerous places that have been reading information, done a lot of research for this, that he guards Mary's tomb, particularly from Wilhelm, who, even back to Lost Jerusalem area, they were always kind of in conflict together for their different perspectives, even though in the end they both just want to save people. It's just a matter of perspective. But anyway, their explanation here, it appeared that way. Part made direct spatial attachment to an area of space near Mictum. This happened when Lost Jerusalem, which had been shrunk down to super micro tiny ass scale levels. That term is available in Episode 1's database if you're interested in learning about it. Returned to normal space together with the appearance of Abel's Ark. However, as Rennes-le-Château spatial continuity has been cut off from Lost Jerusalem, it cannot strictly be defined as a part of the planet. A tomb lies there. Clevin collected and restored the body of Mary, which was resting there. As an aside, it is the name of a small village in the south of France, which we also talked about, said to be the home of Mary Magdalene as the source of many legends and traditions, including stories about the bloodline of Jesus and the Holy Grail. So, yeah, more information on top of what I read. Okay, so the immigrant fleet is something that's completely been reworked in terms of its database entry. I think the first paragraph there is the only thing that's slightly the same as what it was. But basically, it's one of the fleets that left Earth when Lost Jerusalem was going through its connection experiment destruction thing. There's more information about that. I'll talk about it. Actually concerns Wilhelm, but we'll get into there eventually. The start of such and such years, it reunited with another fleet that had escaped from Earth, a group which had already formed a united organization of nations in the form of the Federation. So just because they call them the immigrant fleet doesn't mean they're the only ones that came from Earth and we found humans somewhere else. Everyone eventually, or all the humans came from Earth, but some of them stayed together, and the immigrant fleet specifically was separate from them. The two groups began mutual exchanges, but their historical backgrounds and cultural disparities were too much to bridge. Most importantly of all, the immigrant fleet was in possession of the Zohar. This led to a history of wars and truces that repeated itself countless times. The story, the immigrant fleet, is mostly perceived as identical to Ormus, so we've kind of realized that it's not. The influence of the Ormus doctrine has been diluted amongst some of the immigrant fleet splinter groups, so people who have offshoot from the main, and many have begun their own forms of self-rule. Ormus is still this unifying religion, it just doesn't unify everybody. The groups have advanced a policy of reconciliation with the Federation, and they would later join. So basically, the immigrant fleet has shrunk since these times. It does not consist entirely of pious worshippers swearing their allegiance to Ormus. So yeah, there are different people within the immigrant fleet. The other one in organizations is Ormus, because of course Ormus, general term that unites the immigrant fleet, was established long ago during the Lost Jerusalem era, approximately 40 years AD, and its main goal was to protect the sacred relics and the words of God that had been left by the Messiah. Hence where I got some of my information about the fact that the information that was eventually unearthed by Grimoire Vernum was written down by the Messiah and was not the pure Lemegeton that Chaos event actually brought. Holds different doctrines taken from world religions that would later break off from it. Carries out its own set of sacraments. The Vessel of Anima has been completely rewritten in the database. It is, so to speak, half of Chaos's body. Chaos himself is something like a fail-safe device. In other words, when the consciousness of space begins to go out of control, Chaos has the ability to expunge it along with space itself. The Anima is the expression of that power. Long ago, half of his body, Anima, was decoupled from Chaos by Mary and made into the Vessels of Anima. It was also split at that time, but this saved the world from destruction, but also caused half of Mary's body, the Animus, to disappear or disperse across the area of collective unconsciousness, otherwise known as the UMN. This again kind of goes back to stuff I've already talked about, but I think mentioning some of this stuff twice will allow it to make a little more sense. And I realize that I'm probably going to have to segment this into different episodes now that I realize how long it's taking, but I just want to kind of make a lot of this clear since the game does a poor job of doing it on its own if you stay out of the database and if you don't do your own research. Abel's Arc, a perceptual phenomenon that is the lower dimensional tangible form of the imaginary space consciousness of the higher dimensional being Udu. Yes, they are actually writing sentences like that in here. Basically, Udu sends out himself into the lower dimension, but the only way to do that is kind of by some form of transference. So in the physical realm, it's Abel. In the imaginary realm, it's Abel's Arc. So just kind of how it works. You don't really have to understand it to a great degree, but that's kind of the basic idea of how it works. It's a perceptual phenomenon in the same way that the Gnosis are. There is also a completely different form of existence. Abel's Arc observed Albedo's consciousness during the fall of Old Miltia. It is later said because he was connecting through the Zohar at that time. And the Zohar connects to the upper domain, but it goes through the imaginary domain to get there. So that's how Udu was able to kind of see there. It later took in the Zohar as a connection point in order to more steadily observe the lower dimension. After Shion's awakening, the Arc's imaginary space transformation accelerated, reflecting the consciousness of mankind. Determining the operation of Zarathustra, an anti-higher dimensional system constructed ages ago, it took the planet Mictum into itself, which is what we actually saw in one of the final cutscenes, I think, after we fought Telos? This action was not taken in an attempt to destroy Zarathustra, it was purely trying to observe the changes in the consciousness of the lower dimension. It seems that Udu has a way of communicating that is so different from ours that it creates big problems every time he takes an action in order to understand things. He seems to always have a negative effect on things when he's just trying to observe or to see or to understand. Let's try and learn a little more about what the Gnosis actually are. We thought that they were aliens, and then we realized they were people. Basically, space in the world is made up of normal space and imaginary space. We've kind of talked about this. If you picture normal space as matter or the body, and then imaginary space as consciousness or the mind, then you can kind of understand the comparison. The word gnosis refers to all forms of existence in imaginary space. All things, not just humans, have an imaginary space component, so things like the Gnosis planet, which appears in the story, also do exist. See, they don't have actual matter until they're transported through the divide between the two realms and come into the reality realm or the real realm or whatever you want to call it. In imaginary space, all consciousness is in a state of full awareness, allowing for things like another person's animosity, for example, to be directly experienced. You can kind of see why the people who became Gnosis would be in probably a bad emotional state if they maintain any sense of individuality. They're experiencing everyone's emotion all the time. If a human comes in contact with fear held by imaginary space and chooses to accept or reject it, he or she is nosified. First, it would appear that they act in groups, but each one moves with its own consciousness of rejection, dissipation, and proliferation. They could be seen as wandering in search of a kind of salvation, much like albedo. One could say that this consciousness of rejection and dissipation is putting all of space in peril, which it pretty much is. Wilhelm is attempting to concentrate all of this, the negative consciousness of man, into Zarathustra to awaken the eternal recurrence in order to return once again to the world mankind hoped for. And he's basically doing that. But additionally to that, just to kind of add on to the Gnosis aspect there, they appear in the real world through this connection between the imaginary space and the real world. When they do that, it has to be caused by something. There's not normally enough space, connection for them to come through. Now, what causes this is usually the Zohar. Now, if you think about it, Shion's communication with Udu activates the Zohar 15 years ago. Now it finally explains, going through the database, going through additional information, we finally get an explanation on how she summoned the Gnosis. It was said that she did because of her connection to Udu, and that was it. Hell, I don't even think they said it was because of her connection to Udu, just that it was implied that way. Anyway, continuing on Shion for a quick second, if you remember, she was still, because of her connection to Udu, probably pretty close to death. That's why she wanted to go with Kevin. However, because she was still able to communicate with Udu, but she may end up surviving now that things have changed. They don't even really acknowledge this post-game, but it may have changed because Udu has kind of changed, and because Udu has seen a change in the universe, because the universe did not end here and cycle back in eternal recurrence. It went forward into the future, a future that Udu has never seen before. So something has changed. So it is entirely possible that Udu will choose to leave, and it was possible, he chose to leave Abel in the reality domain, whatever, and it is implied that there is a possibility that he will cease his communication with Shion in order to prolong her life or save her life or whatever. Okay, so here is where the information comes from that implies that Shion is required to awaken the power of Animus. Now, it is talked about that by Telos that the 13th key is Shion and is indispensable to Wilhelm's mission. So basically, it is related to the awakening of the 12 vessels of Anima and the final stages of Mary's revival. So in the past, it is assumed that Shion was required to unleash Mary's full potential as Animus in order to unlock the Vessels of Anima from Chaos. The Compass of Order and Chaos has the ability to display the flow of consciousness in the entire universe through Zarathustra, acting as a terminal point on Mictum. Wilhelm used this to transmit the data collected from Program Kanan to Zarathustra. So there's kind of an extra step in here that they never really talked about before, and I just figured I'd let you guys know about that. To continue on to it, let's go to Zarathustra itself. And a device created by people in ancient times, the gigantic compass-like object is something like a control terminal. The main body is actually the crystalline structures that spread out beneath the surface of Mictum. So the whole planet is really required for this purpose. I don't know how they used this before. Shion's pendant, which has the same structure, is its control key. Not the 13th key, but the control key. It was originally created with the goal of invading the world of God, but Wilhelm, who has the role of protector or guardian of lower dimensional space, where Chaos is kind of protecting everything in general, even if that means taking out the lower dimensional space to save the higher dimensional, brings lower dimensional space to its conclusion, added the functionality of an eternal recurrence device. I already kind of talked about this, but here's some additional kind of confirmation for you. In order to set off eternal recurrence, one must have control over the power of God or the power of Chaos. Now, I said that in the ending, that at some point in the database, and here it is, the power of God, or otherwise known as the power of Chaos. The power of Chaos. Chaos is God. Kind of, sort of. The awakening of each anima, as well as the guidelines of Mary, who shares the emotional bond with Chaos. Again, more references that those two are together and not Mary with the actual Messiah, Jesus, has all been for this purpose. As observation terminals for God, Abel and the Ark, Udu, need to be sealed in lower dimensional space. Consequently, the ability to induce them towards Zarathustra has also been added. I don't think he ever got a chance to do that one, but there's some cool information. That's all for this one, and I'll see you guys next time.